Najee Dorsey's mural, America at 250, was commissioned by the Woodson African American Museum of Florida for its local presentation of Many Voices, One Nation, Our Community, part of the nationwide America 250 initiative. The museum has described the mural as a centerpiece that expands the exhibition's framework by foregrounding Black stories of resilience, migration, resistance, and cultural contribution, too often omitted from conventional national narratives. Now, y'all know I don't do conventional narratives. And that's what makes this mural so powerful. And the fact that it doesn't tell America's story, right, as the smooth chronological march of great white men, right? Instead, Dorsey uses collage and photo montage to stage history as exactly what it is, a contested visual field. The mural's most commanding figure appears at the center, Harriet Tubman. Standing upright with a rifle, Tubman is not placed here as the saintly memory or distant heroine. She is installed as an axis of Black history itself, in that her body literally organizes the mural. This is crucial because Tubman is often flattened in traditional American history into a figure of rescue and compassion alone. So much like Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, and Erykah Badu, Dorsey restores Tubman as a strategist, an armed resistor, and a freedom fighter. So behind and around her, one sees sailing ships, agricultural labor, fields, and Black workers bent over tending the land. The visual effect, then, is to place Tubman not after slavery, but inside the historical machinery of slavery and resistance. Thus, she becomes the hinge between bondage and self emancipation. So, let me flesh that out a little bit more. So, like Charles White's print, General Moses, Dorsey emphasizes Tubman's authority and resolve. And like Catlett's print, he foregrounds the shotgun as a framing for liberation as a collective movement, right, rather than individual escape. And his armed Tubman also resonates with Erykah Badu's album imagery for New America. And the lyric in the single off that album called Soldier, which is playing in the background, that says, quote, "And if you think about turning back, I got the shotgun on your back," right? So this is where Tubman becomes a contemporary symbol, right, of disciplined Black refusal, protection, and forward motion, because she would shoot you, right? Right, if you thought about going back. There's also that quote from her that says, "I could have freed so many more if they just knew that they were enslaved." And I think for America's 250th, right, with us being in the socio-political position that we are in this country, particularly as African Americans, it ranged both Erykah Badu's song, Najee's mural, as well as Catlett and White's depiction of Tubman, reign so true, right, in this moment. Because they all, right, make super clear, right, that freedom was neither granted gently, right, or benevolently achieved, right, but it was seized, it was taken, right, through courage, strategy, and force. And it ain't gonna be no different, right, this time around. In this section, Dorsey makes a crucial historical point: the fact that Europeans did not simply enslave Africans for brute labor. More importantly, they targeted people from specific African regions because they did not have the agricultural, ecological, or technical knowledge they needed to grow cash crops. Thus, the cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, and indigo imagery here matters for that reason. These plantation economies depended on African expertise in cultivation, irrigation, land management, so reaping, harvesting, sowing, as well as processing. Slaveholders were even known to pay more for Africans with specialized agricultural knowledge, especially in the swampy and coastal terrains of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The tools embedded in the field point to the same theft on another register. Plantation agriculture also depended on skilled Black artisans, including blacksmiths, who forged, designed, repaired, and created the hardware, the implements, and the metalwork that made plantation production possible. So Dorsey's collage therefore insists that what was stolen was not just labor and power, but intelligence, technique, and environmental mastery. The swampland, the indigenous figure, and the fort like references push that history into the geography of refusal. Across the southeastern borderlands, including Georgia swamps, the Gulf South, and Spanish Florida, maroon communities formed where self emancipated Africans used difficult terrain and alliances with native peoples to build refuge and resistance. That history culminated powerfully in Black Seminole communities, where freedom seeking Africans and Seminoles alike forged shared survival against U.S. expansion. So the Fort Meade representation here is pointed in that Meade was not a haven, but a U.S. military post established during the Seminole Wars to protect settler control over Seminole territory in Central Florida. In that context, Dorsey stages the swamp not as wilderness, but as a political landscape, one where Black and Indigenous freedom traditions confronted military occupation and removal. The seated guitarist adds another register of survival. Here, Dorsey invokes the blues tradition, the transformation of memory, grief, mobility, trauma, and endurance into sound. While the figure plays the guitar rather than the banjo, the iconography of both instruments carries deep significance in African American visual culture and Southern history in particular. The banjo's African lineage and the guitar's centrality to the blues, particularly its expression, right, together mark the persistence of Black cultural memory despite the rupture and the trauma of the Middle Passage. So, in this sense, Dorsey extends the visual tradition of Tanner and Bearden, using the musician not as decoration, but as evidence that Black people carry form, feeling, and historical consciousness with them, even under the most violent conditions. I tell my students all the time, you can remove a people from a place, but you can't remove a people from their memories. And because collective memory is such a critical aspect of African American culture, I have to say something about how clearly Dorsey is in conversation with Aaron Douglas, particularly his Aspects of Negro Life mural series that he did for the New York Public Library in 1934. In those murals, Douglas offers a visual history of African Americans from Africa to the modern United States, which at the time was 1934. And he does this by compressing historical epochs into these rhythmic, overlapping scenes, which you can see through the concentric circles. So Douglas's series is a visual history of Black life in the exact same way, right? That Dorsey's mural is doing a similar thing. And he takes that same panoramic approach, but instead of silhouetted modernism and radiating geometry, Dorsey uses dense collage, digital layering, and abrupt juxtaposition. So, where Douglas gave us history as stylized procession, Dorsey gives us history as a crowded simultaneity. The point is not that one period replaces another, but that the past keeps pressing into the present. This section of Dorsey's mural compresses the unfinished violence of the 20th century into a single field of accusation. The striped prisoners at left evoke convict leasing and debt peonage, the post-emancipation systems that re-enslave Black people through criminalization, forced labor, and fabricated indebtedness. The sign, "Your hands are full of blood," and Ida B. Wells seated at the writing desk evoke her contributions of Southern horrors on lynchings and a red record, which were her pamphlets that expose lynching not as spontaneous justice, but as the racial terror tied to labor control, political repression, and white supremacy that it was. W.E.B. Du Bois's work, likewise, traced how disenfranchisement, peonage, and racial violence structured modern Black life after slavery, particularly his magnum opus, Souls of Black Folks. Later works, such as Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and Ava DuVernay's 13th, extend that genealogy, showing that mass incarceration and racial criminalization remain a part of slavery's afterlife and a very real occurrence in reality for Black men and women across the country to this day. Dorsey then places Jack Johnson, Muhammad Ali, and Martin Luther King Jr. inside this same history of confrontation. Johnson and Ali both shattered the racial etiquette of their time that was imposed on Black champions, and that they didn't just merely win, but they deliberately refused deference to a white body politic, right? Their bodies became public arguments against white supremacy. King appears here not as the harmless apostle who simply had a dream, right? But as a figure whose politics moved towards structural critique of poverty, militarism, labor, and what we sometimes call democratic socialism. And then there's James Baldwin holding a flashlight, which is such a perfect gesture for Baldwin, right? Because his task in both his literature and his nonfiction writing was always to illuminate, right? To shine unsparingly on the truths that America preferred not to see or tell about itself. So in Dorsey's hand, the flashlight becomes a metaphor for Black intellectual and artistic labor itself, exposing the national lie while insisting that democracy be measured against the lives that it has wounded. Seen in situ, this section of Dorsey's mural takes on the force of a public argument. Zora Neale Hurston stands as a crucial anchor here, not simply as a novelist, but as an anthropologist who understood Black life as worthy of study, beauty, and preservation on its own terms. Beginning from her home ground in Eatonville, Florida, Hurston wrote Black people with intimacy, wit, dignity, and formal brilliance, refusing the pathologizing gaze that so often framed Black Southern life, particularly in anthropology as an academic discipline. So in Dorsey's mural, her presence signals a tradition of Black self-definition, right? Going back to Muhammad Ali, right? Rooted in observation, language, folklore, and love. Yet Dorsey refuses nostalgia. Even beside Hurston's affirmation and the bright charismatic symbolism of Barack Obama as the first Black president, the mural insists that symbolic progress has not undone structural violence. The nearby references to Flint's poisoned water, to the extractive demands of data centers expose the brutal continuity, right? That Black communities remain sites of environmental sacrifice and disposability. Water, the most basic component of condition for life, becomes another terrain where the nation reveals its priorities. Right? So Dorsey's point is devastatingly clear that even at 250, America still celebrates Black achievement while tolerating, implementing, and profiting from the depletion, poisoning, and abandonment of Black people and Black community. And that's the mural's brilliance, right? The way that it holds those two truths together, that Black creativity, Black endurance, and the relentless persistence of capitalism, still organized through Black exploitation, continues to happen to us, right? No matter the epoch. So this is why the mural is also so important for the Woodson's Museum's America's 250-year framing, right? So the official anniversary culture of the country tends to smooth over the conflict, right? In favor of the consensus. Dorsey does the opposite. as most Black people do, right? He insists that Black presence in the American story is not additive, right? It's constitutive. But he also insists that Black contribution cannot be discussed apart from Black suffering, Black resistance, and Black critique. And this is very much in line with the Mexican muralist idea, right? That walls should teach publics how to see history politically. And with Aaron Douglas and Hale Woodruff's insistence that Black muralism must reclaim historical narration from white institutions and public amnesia. So Dorsey is really continuing, right, a historical tradition of visual history, in African American art. The mural is not simply commemorative, right? It's argumentative. And it says that 250 years of America cannot be visualized honestly without centering Black labor. Again, Black resistance, Black leadership, Black creativity, Black intellectualism, Black cultural production, and Black critique. And it says something else as well, right? That the mural as a form remains one of the most potent tools for doing this work. So from Rivera and Securos and Orozco to Aaron Douglas, Charles White, Hale Woodruff, and John Biggers to Nelson Stevens and Afro Cobra, the mural has served as a democratic art form, right? Public, legible, historical, and collective. And Dorsey extends that lineage into the digital collage age, proving that the mural can still function as people's history on a wall.